Okay, so we left off talking about populations and how populations are driven in size by density dependent and density independent factors, and how those can play a role in like the distribution of individuals and where we find them. That leads us into understanding communities and ecosystems. Now, I know I mentioned that if you've ever watched a nature documentary, you've probably seen ecology. Generally speaking, they tend to focus on communities as well as like organismal interactions and population level interactions. And so we're going to be digging into like what is a community? How do we see coevolution here? What is competition versus predation, and some of the biogeochemical cycles that are involved in all of this. So here are our objectives. Okay, make sure you can answer those as questions. And let's talk about communities. A community is a group of populations with a lot of different species interacting with one another. Generally, this is within a single environment, which makes sense, right? Because if you're a fish living on a coral reef in Australia, you're not going to interact with fish living on a reef off of the coast of the Florida Keys, okay? But we were talking about fish within a coral reef. You're talking about the coral themselves, the fish, the predators, the food that they're eating. There's all of these interactions. So community interactions are something that we see on a regular basis and probably don't think about within like the biological aspect. Okay. Ecosystems is the next level up from that because ecosystems also includes the physical environment. So if we're talking about how coral and coral reefs are bonded to rock, the physical environment would be the rock, and then the coral would be the living component, and then the fish living in the coral and having that relationship there is going to be the community component. So these things all kind of bleed into one another, and that's why I call ecology the Russian nesting doll here, because we really can't study ecosystems without first understanding communities. We cannot get this kind of understanding of a big picture without understanding all the bits and pieces that make the picture up. So let's talk about community interactions. Okay. Community interactions are generally formed by relationships that have changed over time. Individual organisms are always interacting with one another, whether that's going to be directly through things like pollination or indirectly through, um, you know, you're finding a food source and someone's already had that food source, so what do you do about it, right? We're seeing these sorts of interactions over time. Now, coevolution is a huge part of this. What we see in terms of like pollinators and their flowers that they prefer. A long-throated flower with a red color is going to attract a hummingbird. It's not going to be trying to attract a bat. A night blooming flower that's going to be really fragrant in smell and white is probably trying to attract a moth. It's not going to be trying to attract a bee who is flying during the day. And we see these kind of relationships because when you have these relationships, they can increase fitness as a result. So because hummingbirds are going to be the main pollinator of honeysuckles, honeysuckles have increased success with their pollination events because the hummingbirds are visiting one honeysuckle flower to another to another. Whereas if I have a generalized flower, I might not see quite as high of a success. It gets really extreme in some cases. So in the top corner here, I have an image of a wasp and a flower. That flower is a kind of orchid that mimics the female wasp. It smells like the female wasp. It looks like the female wasp. It sits at about the same height as the female wasp. That's weird. But what that is we had some changes, some modifications, some mutations that resulted in those flowers that seemed more similar to the female wasp on accident being more attractive to the males. That resulted in increased pollination of those flowers, which then led to an accumulation of those traits over time. Coevolution can be things like um, deer being able to run faster than for a longer period of time than a cheetah, right? An antelope can't really outrun a cheetah in terms of like fast bursts of speed, but they can do it for longer, or they can dodge better. But the cheetahs that are faster can eat the food. And so we see this kind of back and forth push and pull that is going to result in these populations of organisms being interacting with one another on an evolutionary scale. So what else do we have here? Well, understanding communities allows us to understand species richness. Species richness is a kind of biological diversity. And when we are, as an ecologist, looking at an ecosystem, we want to see an ecosystem that is rich within its own context. So different ecosystems will have different species compositions. So for instance, coniferous, your coniferous forest, because your conifers are going to have a different species composition than a tropical rainforest. It doesn't mean that the woodland forest where the moose are living is less complex or has less species diversity than the rainforest, in this idea that I am going to find different species in different ecosystems. I expect to find good diversity of those number of species. How many species are in that ecosystem based on the ecosystem itself? So we determine species richness by listing the number of species in a community and then recording the types and numbers of those species present. So we're going to list, there's 17 different species of pine trees in the coniferous forest, and we see a distribution of 20% of each species present, whatever that may be. The rainforest, we might see 100 different species of plants. That is a higher species richness because when we look at species composition as a whole, that environment can support more additional species, but both of them they're just different, right? We can't really compare them. It's apples to oranges. But if we want to compare and calculate biodiversity in that way, what we're really looking at is the number, the various species, what kind of species are present, and then how many of each are present. This does allow us to do a little bit of calculation, not math like Hardy Weinberg, but a little bit of calculation of species diversity. So biodiversity goes beyond just like the number of species present and includes the abundance and distribution of those species. And it also includes a lot of genetic diversity. So if I have one clone that's taken over an entire environment, that's not a very good diverse environment. Okay, we want biodiversity because biodiversity results in higher health of that ecosystem. So if we're looking at these two communities, we have community 1 and community 2, and we're just looking at the trees in these communities. If I look, I have the same species in both communities. I have this large kind of canopy oak looking species, I have a maple looking species, and then I have two different pine tree species, a dark pine and a light pine. In community 2, I have those same species represented. But almost immediately looking at community 2, I notice that I have more of that light colored deciduous tree represented than any other species. That's not usually great. What that ends up meaning is that we don't have good evenness of that community. So in community 1, if I were to count, okay, I have 25% of the population for each of these trees. So if I had 100 trees, 25 of them would be of species 1, of species 2, of species 3, of species 4. I have the same evenness and the same richness, which means I have higher diversity in community 1. Community 2, 70% of my trees are one kind. So if I counted 100 trees again, if 70 of them are one species, okay, and then I have two species that make up 12% each of the population, and then one species that's only 6% of the total population, I do not have even abundance or evenness. I don't have a good distribution of those individuals. And so even though I have a high species richness of 4 species total, I have a lower biodiversity because I have a monoculture essentially, or one species that is dominating that landscape. Now, that's not to say that that's not the norm. There are some places where, the savannas, you're going to have grasses and you might have one kind of grass that dominates a majority of the ecosystem. That's not necessarily what we would see in a natural, healthy ecosystem, but it's not always a bad thing, okay? If you go up to the boreal forest, it's mostly one species of pine tree that's up there. Cool. That's because that does really well in that environment. But if we're looking at an environment like in your backyard here in North Carolina, we would expect a better, more even richness and evenness, right? Species evenness and richness, abundance and evenness, as compared to having like a monoculture. And unfortunately, we do have mostly monocultures here because your backyard is probably grass. It's probably all crabgrass or Kentucky bluegrass. And that's where we see the problem coming in because that can't support as many other individual organisms. Okay. When we talk about ecology, then, how do we maintain diversity? How do we increase biodiversity? Well, one of the biggest ways is to have some of those density independent factors happen, those abiotic factors, things like fires, things like soil disturbances, a tree is uprooted. And because of that, we call those disturbance regimes. Okay. Most natural ecosystems, communities, and ecosystems benefit from disturbance regimes. These regimes are like the savanna is supposed to burn every year. It's supposed to. Okay. Forest fires are supposed to happen naturally. And there are a lot of communities that rely extensively on fire in order to actually have their seeds even germinate and sprout, right? You have some pine trees that the cone is coated in a wax, jack pines, their cone is coated in a wax that melts during fires. And until a fire occurs, no new baby trees can be born. That is important, and that evolved because these disturbance regimes were natural, predictable patterns that kind of mixed up what was happening in that ecosystem. Species in these systems are adapted to the regimes that are naturally occurring. So floods, right? You have flooding off of rivers. Species are adapted to those floods. You see a lot of cypress in swampy areas that are going to handle both drying and wet environments. You have fires that occur naturally in ecosystems. Animals and plants in those systems are going to be better adapted to that because that is a selection pressure. Now, we as humans have been disrupting natural disturbance regimes. Unfortunately, Smokey the Bear did something that wasn't great. So Smokey the Bear is only you can prevent forest fires, but it meant to be towards human-based forest fires. You flick an ash from a cigarette and you start a fire, or you do, God forbid, a gender reveal that burns down part of Colorado. That's what Smokey the Bear was trying to stop, was these human created disturbances that are not part of the natural disturbance regime. Unfortunately, people took it to be all fires are bad, which is absolutely not true. Fires are really good at releasing nutrients, removing dead and decaying organisms, getting some of those debris and that detritus out of the way, and allowing for this natural progression of these ecological successions. Okay, so when you have a flood, when you have a hurricane, when you have something that like wipes out some trees, that is what we would call a secondary succession. If the soil is left in place and the soil is non-disturbed and you still have live things in there, seeds and earthworms and bacteria and fungi, you're going to see a really quick resurgence of plant species as a result. So here in Jacksonville, we do a lot of controlled burns, especially along things like 17 near base, where you're going to have like fires potentially from munitions. Controlled burns are really important as part of that regime of preventing forest fires. If you go through an area where they've done a burn recently, the pine trees are still alive. The large adult trees are still alive. But you'll see that the forest underneath is all just black and the vines are gone, the bushes are gone. It's fairly defoliated. It's going to be really not green. But if you go back a week later, 2 weeks later, you're going to very quickly see these plants coming back to life. Any bushes that had their leaves burned off, they're going to put new leaves out. You're going to see this recovery of grasses. And if you were to go out and do an assessment on the species abundance and diversity, right, the richness and that whole biodiversity, you'll see that a disturbance like a fire is going to increase the biodiversity of that ecosystem because it's removing things that were in the way and that were stopping different species from growing and living in that environment. That's good. We want to see that, okay? That's a secondary disturbance, and those are very normal. Floods, fires, hurricanes, a tree gets knocked down, right? That's a secondary type of disturbance, and those are really cyclical, okay? Primary disturbances are a little less cyclical, a little more problematic, and that would be something like a volcanic eruption. okay? If we wipe the slate blank, we just completely start over. A volcano erupted, and everything is covered in lava. Nothing survives the lava, okay? Bacteria, archaea, earthworms, fungi, whatever it is. Once that lava cools, it can be broken down slowly by lichen and fungi and bacteria, and eventually you'll see a colonization of plants. That is called a primary succession, and that is going to be a really big disturbance. It's still beneficial. We still see it happen, and we still see really cool effects as a result. Okay. And this is where some of that observational science comes in. When we're doing ecology, if we're wanting to look at primary successions, you're going to have to go and find like a natural disaster, like when Mount St. Helens exploded. Okay. That has been an area of study since then, because wherever that volcano exploded and that rock burst out from that mountain, it became an area of primary succession. We were starting from scratch. And so people have been able to study that over the last, oh gosh, that happened in the 1980s, over the last 40 years. Now, secondary successions we can do. If I say I want to go out and do a controlled burn, I can get permissions to do that, and then I can monitor what happens in that ecosystem as a result, and I can see secondary succession. That is something that we can kind of control. If you've ever done like clear cutting in the back of your yard, or if you've ever just left your yard and not mown it for a while, you didn't mow your yard for a while, you're going to see some secondary succession occurring because you're allowing those plants to grow and become effective. And then you're going to see the biodiversity of your yard change. Again, disturbances, absolutely essential, something that is naturally occurring. No, do I want to have human-caused floods or human-caused disasters, fires, explosions, defoliation because of, biological agents? No, that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about it in terms of like what these ecosystems have done for millennia and how these organisms are adapted to it. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on communities and ecosystem succession and succession cycles. And then now we're going to talk about biological community interactions for the rest of today's lecture. So, what is a community interaction? Predation, competition, commensalism, my husband's favorite. He loves commensalism, and mutualism. Okay? When you watch those nature documentaries and you see a lion chasing a gazelle, that is consumption. That is going to be a direct relationship between the lion and the gazelle. Or competition, right? You see two animals trying to eat the same food source. Mutualism, where you see the little birds cleaning the alligator's teeth. Okay, commensalism is kind of an odd one. I'll talk about that in a little bit here. But basically, what you need to remember with these community interactions is these are between the living factors. So environmental interactions can be non-living, like rain is falling and you're getting wet. What are you going to do? Okay. We're right now focusing on biotic, or the living factors. So this is going to be these interactions between populations or individuals within populations, and they're subject to change depending on the lens that you're looking at it, okay? While consumption could be one organism eating another, it could be something else. It could be commensalism. It could be mutualism. It could be any number of things. That being said, when we look at it from a very straightforward point of view, most things fall into one of these, and I'm going to talk about all of them a little bit. I liked this little flow chart here of environmental interactions with biotic, because we have competition and then we have symbiosis. It puts a little bit different of a spin on it. I want you to know it by competition, consumption, commensalism, and mutualism. But symbiotic relationships are that same living idea, and that can be parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. However, parasitism, we are still feeding, so we're going to see that as consumption. When you see these, and I'm talking about competition being negative, negative, okay, this is talking about fitness or energy, okay? If I'm putting all my energy into fighting for a resource, I cannot be putting that energy into making babies. Therefore, I have lost that energy, and it is a negative interaction for me, even if I win. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So when we talk about competition, no one wins. Everyone loses fitness, and so it's a negative interaction for everyone involved. Consumption, someone is going to gain fitness because you get energy from eating, and someone is going to lose fitness because if you get eaten, you have no fitness. Okay? Commensalism is going to have a gain of fitness for one and the other one is not affected. And then mutualism is when both species gain from that interaction. And again, these are subject to change depending on the situation. So let's talk about each of them a little bit more. Competition is a negative interaction. Generally speaking, both species will have an abundance decrease if they are directly interacting with one another. So I have an example here. This is an experiment from the 1930s with Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. These are little protists, and if you let them grow separately, their population densities are pretty high. Let's give an arbitrary number to these. If we let Paramecium aurelia grows separately, it gets to about 95 individuals in the population, and Paramecium caudatum is about 80 individuals in the population. So they're both doing pretty good, okay? If I put these two species of Paramecium together, because they use the same resources, we actually see a decrease in both populations. Paramecium aurelia still does well, and it will still have a huge population compared to Paramecium caudatum, but it's dropped down to about 80 individuals from 95. So we've lost about 15 individuals total, and that is a decrease in fitness, right? Fitness being those number of babies being born. Paramecium caudatum actually dropped from 80 individuals to about 5. So there's always a worse loser in these sorts of situations. There's a worse loser, but even the winner is a loser because we are losing fitness as a result of these competitive interactions for a resource. Okay, there are two kinds of competition that we generally look at: inter and intra-specific competition. So intra-specific competition is between the same species, amongst the same species, intra. And then inter is between different species. And I love this because I get to talk about great tits. Just like with blue-footed boobies, with birds, people name birds weird things. Great tits are a chickadee-like bird in Europe, over in Britain. And they are nasty little buggers. They fight with everybody. They fight with each other. They fight with other species. They have been known to consume like mice. They kill and eat mice in some cases, and they're a songbird. They are just out to fight. Okay. When you have two great tits fighting with one another, that's going to be intra-specific competition, and that can still reduce the fitness of both of these, because at this point, they are putting in energy to fight against one another. They could be hurt. They could get injured, and that injury then requires energy to heal. And so we do see them both having a loss of fitness as compared to if they didn't fight with one another at all. Interspecific competition is when you have things like a food source and you have things like the house sparrows and the great tits fighting for the food source. Now, in this image, the house sparrow is in the bird feeder, defending the food from the great tit, and it looks almost like the house sparrow is pecking the great tit in this image. But while that house sparrow is fighting against the great tit, it's at risk of injury, right? And it is not eating. It is not eating at that point, and so it is spending energy that it's going to have to make up for by eating. Now, is it beneficial to fight off the great tit and get all of that food to themselves? Probably, but is the food in a birdhouse or bird feeder really going anywhere? Probably not. So we do see a lot of competition in that way. Competition does drive evolution. It's a huge driving force of evolution. We actually see it changing how organisms utilize their environment. So when we're talking about an organism's habitat, that's going to be where those organisms live within a community. Maybe like if I were to go look for moss, I'm going to go look under a tree. Or if I want to go find a wolf, I'm not going to go downtown. I'm going to go out into the woods, okay? That's going to be where we find those organisms, living within that community, within some part of the ecosystem. Now, within a habitat, we do have niches. Niches are going to be where that species plays a role in its community, habitat, and interactions. And where that species could be as compared to where that species is dependent on the interactions with other organisms in a community. As such, if you have intense competition for a resource, organisms are often pushed out of what we would consider a fundamental niche where they could be, and they are pushed into a realized niche where they are actually found. So, what am I talking about here? These are MacArthur's warblers. This is a study that was done by a gentleman named MacArthur. And what he noticed is that when warblers of different species were utilizing a conifer tree for food, there were not overlapping uses of the environments within the majority of the species. But if one of the species was missing, the other species would move into that area and utilize that food source. So what does that mean? That means that the Blackburnian warbler generally uses the outside branches of a pine tree as a food source, whereas the Cape May warbler is in closer to the trunk. But if I remove the Cape May warbler, the Blackburnian warbler will also utilize the spaces in near the trunk. There's competition, and in order to avoid competition, these birds just utilize different parts of that tree. So our paramecium couldn't do that, right? The paramecium are growing in a lab, they're growing in the same environment, there's going to be competition for food sources. If I were to put those paramecium into pond water, I might not find them overlapping their range. They may not be in the same environment because Paramecium caudatum is not as strong a competitor as Paramecium aurelia, where Paramecium caudatum might be able to utilize the entirety of that pond water. I'm only going to find them on particular algae, where I'm going to find Paramecium aurelia utilizing the rest of that resource. Okay, we see this kind of role being pushed onto these organisms as a way of avoiding competition. Again, if I'm putting energy into fighting for a source, I am not mating. I am not making babies. I'm not putting energy into making babies. If I'm putting energy into fighting for a food source and I have risk of getting injured, I'm not putting that into fitness. If I'm fighting for a mate, now there's benefits there and there's that sexual selection at play, but you can only do it for so long, right? You're putting energy into fighting for mates, then you're not putting energy into surviving the winter. And that's where some of those like fitness trade-offs come in and that life history continuum as well. After competition, another huge factor in evolution is going to be consumption. Okay, consumption is going to be where we see the abundance of the consumed individual decrease and the consumer increases. What that means is that by consuming, I gain fitness. Okay, by being consumed, I lose fitness. And that makes sense to us, right? If I say, okay, but if you die, what's your fitness? Most of you are like, there's no babies, there's no fitness. Absolutely. So there are three kinds of consumption. And again, parasitism kind of straddles symbiosis, which is a kind of biotic interaction, but we're going to lump it into consumption because something is being eaten. Okay. You have predation, where a predator feeds on prey, like a red fox eating a rabbit. You have parasitism, where the parasite gets nutrients from the host but doesn't kill it, like ticks on a rabbit. And you have herbivory, where an animal eats all or part of a plant, like a rabbit eating grass. And yes, I absolutely had to do rabbits for all three of these because they play roles in all three of these areas. Now, is the fox being evil by killing and consuming the rabbit? No, that is what the fox needs to do in order to feed its offspring, right? In order to increase its own fitness. That is normal. Now, that rabbit's fitness might not be zero. It might have reproduced several times before it was consumed, but its future fitness is zero, and so it has a decrease in its overall fitness, okay? When a rabbit has ticks, now these three ticks on this rabbit, these are ticks, these balloon gray shapes are ticks that are full of blood, which I know is gross, but you know, it is what it is. When a rabbit has three ticks, that's not going to kill the rabbit. That's not going to hurt the rabbit. But it does take nutrients from the rabbit. And when those nutrients are removed from the host, it does decrease their fitness, right? Because the host is eating those food sources to get that ATP, to get that nutrition, and the ticks have now taken it. So there is going to be a decrease there. When it becomes a problem is when the parasite load is really high. So I had a vole when I was doing my research. We found a meadow vole that had botflies. Botflies are a parasite similar to ticks, but they lay their eggs and then the larvae bury into the skin of the host. Meadow voles weigh maybe 30 grams. They're not really large animals. And this meadow vole had 7 bot flies. It was dehydrated. It was basically skin and bones. It had been consumed by these parasites to the point of death. That's going to be when we see a big problem, okay? And then herbivory, you eat an apple, you are an herbivore then, and in doing so, you are maybe doing something good for the apple if you throw the seeds and they grow, right? That would be seed dispersal, but generally speaking, we eat the apple, we throw the seeds away in the garbage, and that's the end of that. So that would decrease the fitness of that apple because we are not planting those seeds, okay? I think that's it for consumption. If you have questions on it, please let me know. Also, go watch some nature documentaries and think about this more. It really will open up the nature documentaries. Now let's talk about my husband's favorite. Okay, my husband likes to tell me that everything is commensalism, and it's not. Commensalism is when one species' fitness increases and the other one is not affected. So things like a dog in the shade under a tree, that dog is not affected, okay? The dog is affected. It gets the coolness from the shade. The tree is not affected, all right? Generally speaking, if we talk about something like commensalism or even competition or predation, right, we can easily see those shift into different environments and areas. We can absolutely see, again, seed dispersal with herbivory. It might be consumption, but really it's mutualism because it's allowing those plant seeds to move away from the parent plant, and that's going to be really beneficial. But commensalism is one that really easily changes into competition, consumption, or mutualism. And I have an image on here of an antelope that has a spider web between its horns. Now, this is, if you Google commensalism, it's one of the first images that pops up in the Googles, okay? And honestly, it is. If the antelope is not affected in any way, shape, or form, the spider is gaining a benefit by having a mobile web. That web is now able to move around, and the spider is not stuck in one location. That's hugely beneficial to the spider. But antelopes attract biting flies. So now the biting flies are getting caught in the web. That's predation because the spider is eating the flies. It's parasitism because the flies are eating the antelope. And if the flies are being removed from eating the antelope and it reduces the parasite load, it is now mutualism by having a spider growing there. Furthermore, it can become competition because if this spider web that's covering this antelope's eye blocks its vision and stops it from being able to see a cheetah coming at it, it has now reduced the fitness of that antelope, and so now it's competition. So when I say that these are not set in stone, that's kind of what I mean. You will have a question on the test to do matching of what it should be, and then I'm going to ask you to think about what something could be outside of that. So think about it. Think about how things might not fit easily into boxes, which I hope we've learned. We like boxes as humans, but it's not always going to be something that is effective when we're talking about biology. And then last but not least for today's lecture, I want to finish talking about mutualism. So mutualism is when both species increase when they are present with one another. So this is a symbiotic relationship. This is going to be obviously between our pollinators and our flowers. We have that extreme coevolution, like this curved flower that is reliant on this particular bird. This is a Hawaiian bird. This bird pollinates this flower and nothing else. Like that is what it does. And it is set up in such a way that it is just, they need one another, okay? But I really like talking about coyotes and badgers. People know about mutualism. That one's pretty straightforward. Coyotes and badgers, though. When things are good, when there is enough food source, when there are enough prairie dogs, coyotes and badgers work together to hunt. And when they work together, they are 90% successful in their hunts, which is huge as a predator. Badgers are not fast. They can dig really well, and coyotes are fast. So coyotes will help the badgers find the prairie dogs. The prairie dogs will start digging at one of the entrances. Prairie dogs have multiple holes that exit their tunnels. Coyotes will watch. So the prairie dogs go to the back door to get away from the badger, what's coming in the front door, and there's a coyote there to eat it. So the coyote is chasing them back into the tunnels, and so then the prairie dogs are basically stuck between a coyote and a badger. And that increases the success rate of hunting for both of these organisms. But if prairie dog numbers are low, it becomes competition and they will fight one another for resources. And it's just not going to be that symbiotic relationship then, okay? Both of them do much better when they hunt together. 90% success rate for predators is insane. But again, it's all about the resources that are available. Go back, review disturbances, review community systems, and then we're going to talk about what happens when we mess them up. Thank you very much and have a great day.